Good evening, everyone. My name is E.R. Anderson. I'm the executive director of Caris Circle. Caris Circle is a nonprofit programming arm of Caris Books, and Caris Books is the South's oldest independent feminist bookstore. We're very, very honored to welcome Annelise Orleck in conversation with Shonda Neal Green for a discussion of storming Caesar's Palace, how Black mothers fought their own war on poverty. It has been revised and updated and served as inspiration for the PBS documentary, which premiered this year in March of 2023. We hope you've all seen it, but if you haven't, go back and check it out on PBS. Storming Caesar's Palace is the story of the revolutionary Black women welfare organizers of Las Vegas who spearheaded an evergreen, radical revisioning of American economic justice. The timely reissue tells a little-known story of a pioneering group of Black mothers who built one of this country's most successful anti-poverty programs. Tonight's event is co-hosted by 9 to 5, one of the largest, most respected national membership organizations of working women in the United States, which is dedicated to putting working women's issues on the public agenda. So we have loved working with 9 to 5 year after year. And as Shonda told us in the chat, or in the green room, 9 to 5 is turning 50 this year. Caris is turning 48. Your book is turning how old is your book turning?
Let's see, 2005. My book is just 18. It's a teenage.
Just 18. But this is a rare thing. I don't know if folks who are outside the book world realize it's actually quite a rare thing to have a book be reissued in this way, in such a beautiful package with such fanfare. And it really does speak to the importance of this book. So I want to introduce Shonda Neal Green first, who is the Georgia Associate State Director of 9 to 5. Shonda is a firm believer that someone else's opinion does not define you or what you can accomplish in life if you are willing to fight. A graduate of Winston-Salem State University with a degree in political science, she was a vanguard for grassroots organizing and politics. Collegiate activism led to campaign work for city council elections in Winston-Salem, North Carolina. She seeks to leave the world a better place, whether by giving a voice to the voiceless or redeeming social, political, and economic conditions that keep people oppressed. And the person of the hour tonight is Annelise Orleck, who is professor of history at Dartmouth College and the author of 5 books on the history of U.S. women, politics, immigration, and activism, including the book we are celebrating tonight, Storming Caesar's Palace. She lives in Thetford Center, Vermont. So if you read Storming Caesar's Palace back in 2005, we want to let you know that this book has a new prologue and epilogue that explore the race and labor movements that are paramount to our current political dynamic. So there has been an update, and unfortunately this book is as timely as ever. And I know that y'all are going to get right into it. Some things have not changed at all, and perhaps have gotten a little bit worse since 2005. So I want to encourage folks, if you are watching and you would like to ask a question, feel free to put it in the chat or in the ask a question box. But for now, I would love to just get out of the way and let y'all get right into it, because I personally am very excited for this conversation. So thanks so much to both of you for being with us.
Thank you.
Awesome. Thank you, ER, for such great introductions. And we are definitely glad to be here and honored to have this discussion with you all here this evening. As ER said, if there is a PBS documentary, if you have not had the opportunity to watch it, we definitely encourage you to do so. It is phenomenal. Tonight's discussion is going to focus a little bit more on the book, and then also bringing in some points from the PBS documentary that was aired this year. So again, we are here, and welcome everyone to our discussion. So kind of just want to set the stage for folks who may have not read the book or seen the documentary as of yet. So the book Storming Caesar Palace is a masterful blend of how anti-poverty policies in the U.S. really sparked poor people's political movements. And there's plenty of evidence that we can look towards, that we see that where policies really spark people into action, because they are really hugely impacted by those issues that we'll hear talk about today as we honor and discuss the women who brought us Operation Life in Nevada. So Annelise, I want to turn it over to you for just for a moment for you to kind of give us a context of how you see the activism through Nevada and the Women of Operation Life and what is happening in context of now in 2023.
Sure. First of all, thank you, Shanda, for co-sponsoring and for speaking with me here tonight. And thank you for the work that 9 to 5 does and that you do. And thank you, everyone who I know and who I don't know for being here tonight. I appreciate it. The Women of Operation Life really embodied the story of the American anti-poverty program and the social safety net. And, in the sense that, they were born in the 30s when when the Social Security Act was passed and when you first had a federal program of aid to the poor. And they were the last sharecroppers. They were living in really, really dire conditions when they moved to Las Vegas. And Las Vegas really, it fulfilled their promises in some ways. It was, Alversa Beals liked to say, she says in the documentary, she earned as much, in a day as she used to earn in a week, and she was in the shade. She could work indoors. But Las Vegas was also a Jim Crow town. It was segregated. They could work in the Strip, but they couldn't go back and eat dinner there. They couldn't go to the shows. And so it was disappointing in that sense. And the work was brutal, and people got injured and ended up on public assistance. And it was a moment like this one where there was a real war on the poor. And so by 1970, Ronald Reagan was governor of California, and he was urging one of his disciples, George Miller, who's the head of the welfare program in Nevada, to model what it would look like if you really start slashing the rolls, if you start cutting off thousands of people. And so he did just that. And these women, influenced by the National Welfare Rights Movement, and by its amazing leaders, Johnny Tillman and Beulah Sanders, decided to fight back because they had been taught that the power poor people have, if they want to be heard, they have to hit people in the pocketbook. And as Ruby Duncan, the 37-year-old mother of 7 and kitchen worker and hotel housekeeper, she said, "Oh, I work on the Strip every day. That is the pocketbook. That is the main vein." And so they launched Operation Nevada. They called in the leaders of the National Welfare Rights Movement. They called in welfare moms from all across the country. And as well, they brought in some celebrities, most notably Jane Fonda and Donald Sutherland and the baby Dr. Spock. They wanted to avoid getting shot. It was still a mobbed up town, and it was also a libertarian state, and they just didn't know what would happen. So they shut down the Strip for a couple of weeks running, which had never been done before. It was historic. And they stormed Caesar's Palace and, got their kids into the casino, and there are pictures in the national newspapers of Mary Wesley's skinny little boy, Alan, his arms holding up a sign saying Nevada starves children. Anyway, they were able to be restored to the rolls. But the state, they were angry about that. And so they started throwing people off again, and this civil disobedience went on for a couple of years, including in their campaign to get food stamps into the state of Nevada. They had eat-ins. They had an eat-in in the casino. Those days, Las Vegas, you would come in and they'd offer you an all-you-can-eat buffet for 10 cents. In the meantime, there were people, suffering from malnutrition, children who had had so little to eat for so long during this period of welfare cuts that they had lasting malnutrition, rickets and pellagra. So they fought back. And at a certain point, they had eat-ins in the casinos and read-ins in whites-only libraries because the state was terrible about providing any kind of public library services. There were no medical services on the Black side of town. And so they became interested in doing something longer lasting. And that's how they started Operation Life. Which was, they called it in the poverty community, of the poverty community, for the poverty community. So they ran it themselves. They got an amazing array of grants. Ruby Duncan was a genius at going to Washington and figuring out all the hallways and offices where there were little grants they could qualify for. And they ended up running a 100-person social service agency that at one point had incredible statistics. They screened the highest percentage of eligible poor children of any federally funded pediatric clinic in the country. They ran a community newspaper. They was solarizing their houses 50 years ago. So they did all of this. That's their story. And that's the story this book and the documentary tell. How does it relate to now? You know, I was listening to the radio and there was the majority leader, Chuck Schumer, talking about the House GOP majority's attempt to eviscerate SNAP, which is today's version of food stamp, Supplemental Nutrition Assistance Program. And he said, you know, they are literally talking about taking food out of the mouths of hungry children, which is true. And I heard Ruby Duncan's voice, the voice of the leader of this movement. I said, Ruby said that. She could have said it. She did say it. And so, you know, we need to be telling this story again. And, you know, she liked to quote Coretta King, who said violence is a hungry child, you know, because there were all these politicians always saying, oh, Black people in the streets, it's going to be violent. She's like, violence is a hungry child. And I would say that again. I think the women, Ruby's still around. She would certainly say it again today.
Yeah, and kind of going to that point, you mentioned early on in the introduction of the book, kind of this notion that lawmakers now, and you kind of see it today, that they can't see women or couldn't see women, right? And see women's value and contribution to the larger society, right? We see rollbacks on key legislation like Roe versus Wade. We see a huge healthcare crisis, especially for Black and brown women, right? The huge disparities when it comes to women in this country, when we talk about creating economic security for women to be able to thrive and live in the way that they see fit, right? And not something that's being mandated or dictated to them. And one thing that I love that you brought into the story is that with all the examples that you used with the war on poverty and the New Deal, it always seemed like, you know, they said one thing, you know, in the war on poverty, but it always seemed like, well, the women, the breadwinners, the one who were running the families and the communities were left out of that conversation. It was always focused on men, in particular, white men. Right. So can you talk a little bit of some examples of how that kind of deteriorated the wins and the things that Ruby Duncan and the Operation Life were able to obtain and win over those years of kind of that back and forth teeter-tottering before with legislators, right? About like we are the experts. We know what our needs are. Let us run this, right? And being seen as trusted people to do that.
That's the really brilliant thing about their strategy is, you know, that they said it's not the social safety net really matters. Getting food aid, getting medical care to people who need it is important, but it is equally important. And the Head Start program also did this. I think it comes out of the civil rights movement as well. Said, you know, it has to come from our own community, right? And poor mothers are the real experts on poverty. They have to balance, you know, a skimpy budget, and they have to figure out how to feed their kids, and they have to care for their children. And they were able to do this in remarkable ways. I mean, Operation Life began with sweat equity. They rehabbed the women themselves and their friends and their sons and their, you know, boyfriends in the community. You know, they rehabbed an abandoned hotel in their community from the days of segregation, where they used to have these jam sessions with, you know, Sammy Davis Jr. and Nat King Cole and Lena Horne and, you know, all the great entertainers who played the Strip but weren't allowed to sleep there, and they'd come over to the West Side. So anyway, this building had an amazing life, and it was actually, the hotel was originally bought by Sammy Davis Jr. and the fighter Joe Louis, but it had become a place where, you know, basically a shooting gallery where you know, addicts shot up and where they were sleeping, and they were hoping to do something better with it for the community. So that's the kind of practice they started with, right? Taking this eyesore that had become dangerous, but also had this really esteemed heritage in the community, and making it theirs again, right? And so they rehabbed it and they opened it up, and they got federal funds to run a clinic. And really, I think they did amazing things. But the jewel in many ways of their program was the early periodic screening and diagnostic testing program, and the Women and Infant Children Nutrition Program. Those two federal programs enabled them to give medical care to pregnant mothers, and healthy food to young children. And also the screening program was great, because if you screened the children for any number of diseases, you could treat them for free. And so that's what they did. But they didn't just do that, right? Because they're poor mothers, the real experts on poverty, and they knew how hard it was. They knew that women didn't have cars and there were no bus routes to get the kids down to the clinic. And so they all piled into one of the women's station wagons. Dorothy Jean Poole had a station wagon, and then they would get to, a neighborhood, and they would all split up, and they would go into the houses, and they would help the women, get their kids ready. And Alversa Beals liked to say, she'd go in there and they'd say, I have so many children, I can't get them ready. And she'd say, I have more than you. I have 11. And I managed to get them to school and out of bed, and everybody graduated high school. You can do it. So it's really different. That's what they said. It's really different when it's one of their own, right? Who's coming in and saying, we can do this. So that spirit was amazing. And of course, there was always a backlash from the politicians. As you said, they'd say, oh, you must be cheating, or you must be skimming money off the books, or maybe you don't know how to keep the books. Alversa Beals, who had only a 6th grade education, designed her own bookkeeping system. And so when they came in to audit her books in the clinic, she ran that clinic, for 20 years, taking care of the books, answering the phones, letting people in. And they audited her books. The feds came in, the state came in, the city came in. And the only thing they could find misallocated was 4 cents, right? They had programs getting hundreds of thousands and ultimately millions of dollars of aid coming in, and she had this amazing program. So, it affirmed their slogan, we can do it and do it better. And they did. They brought in a library. They collected 10,000 books themselves. It was the largest collection and the only public library that specialized in African-American heritage and history and African history. They brought those books in. Now there's a beautiful library. They opened child care center. They had a community newspaper. They made it a vibrant space. And you're right, the politicians tried to go after them for it. And I think, we see that today too. There was a saying during the Trump years, the cruelty is the point. We often saw that with these women. I think the work you do, I'm sure you see it now.
Yes. And speaking to a little bit to the identities and how often, kind of from slavery to sharecropping to Jim Crow, and how that built certain ideologies and narratives around groups of people, right? So in the book, it talked about living in a culture that devalued poor, Black, and female, right? So it really made it easy to make Black women the scapegoat for all the social problems that was happening after the wars. So how can you explain a little bit of how you see those narratives still playing out in policy and legislation that we see today? So I know you mentioned earlier, we see the attack on SNAP and other pieces, but can you talk about how those ideologies and particularly Southern ideologies that found themselves in the West and in the North, right? Sometimes we think that the West and the North were just like these great places for Black people, but a lot of times they were still victims of discrimination, harassment, and violence, just like their Southern counterparts. So can you speak a little bit to how the narratives and ideologies really have a pervasive way of impacting policy and legislation that really uplift people?
Oh, absolutely. I mean, the Jim Crow West, that was one of the things I learned about doing this book, is that there was a Jim Crow West, and the ideologies followed along with the people when they migrated from most of the Black community in Vegas came from Tallulah, Louisiana, Greenville, Mississippi, and Fordyce, Arkansas. And when they came, the white supremacy and the devaluing of poor Black and female came with them. And, that was partly responsible for the terrible conditions that, that Black migrants lived in Vegas, but also across the West. the Harlem Renaissance writer Arna Bontemps wrote a book in the early 60s called They Seek a City. And he called these neighborhoods mud towns because literally they wouldn't be paved. You wouldn't have street lights. You don't have sewage systems. Ultimately those neighborhoods were fixed up. But the contrast between the glitz of the Strip in the 1960s, right, in the Rat Pack era, and the falling down shacks without plumbing, with sometimes rugs for doors, and swamp coolers in 115-degree heat. Swamp coolers you basically had a sponge, a fan, and a wet rag.
I learned what those were from reading the book. I was like, that's just hot. And I've been to Las Vegas. I would have just melted away.
Yeah. And I think they did. So they had to fight on all those fronts, right? They had to fight for that in the way that you and 9 to 5 are doing. They had to fight, in terms of labor. They worked in the hotels. They joined the union. That was one of the first things they did when they got there, is they joined, the still vibrant Culinary Workers Union. And, and that was remarkable because they learned, it was the only union at that time that had a Black woman business agent, Sarah Hughes. And they learned that once a contract was signed, the boss couldn't say, as Ruby learned, oh, we're getting a convention tonight, you have to work a double shift. And she's like, no, I don't. I have 7 kids waiting for me at home. I'm not working nights. And she could, the housekeeper was from the South. She was from Florida. She fired her, the manager. And Ruby went to Sarah Hughes, and Sarah Hughes went back and argued her case. And, it was a union contract. She was reinstated. So that was an education for them. It really was. And it also gave them a sense of pride and power that, as Ruby said, for all the years, we were the ones that everyone was demanding things of. And it felt really good to finally be the ones doing the demanding. So it started with the union, then it moved to, defending their kids in the welfare rights movement. And then it moved to their vision of economic development through social service. Ruby liked to say, all those nasty politicians, would say these terrible things about us, beginning with Ronald Reagan and all the way through, Bill Clinton's role in ending welfare as we know it. And they said, she said, we actually got people off welfare, and we got them off welfare, giving them jobs to take care of the community and, and do all kinds of jobs that were so desperately needed. So again, proof of their saying we can do it and do it better.
Yes, I love that. Yeah, and just seeing and kind of speaking to that point, I used to do work in labor organizing, and just the getting workers to understand their rights, and then them, flexing their muscles, like that is a beautiful thing. So just reading that, just from my own experience, being able to see what that looks like in real time, and when people come together, right, from their own lived experience and what that really looks like. And kind of going back to the unionization, the book talks about the hotel and culinary workers. As you talk to, the Strip was a large part of the labor force for Black men and women in the state of Nevada during that time. And you spoke about, Hughes teaching and them about, what does it mean to be in a union, and how to, like you said, flex some of that union muscle. How do you see unions today really recapturing kind of the hope and the dreams and the kind of from the labor movement that we see from the Fight for 15, and really rallying workers around, dignity, respect on the job, having access to a lot of the things that Ruby Duncan and the women from Operation Life were really fighting for during those times. You kind of see that resurgence of workers today fighting for some of those same things.
Absolutely. And I'm glad you brought up Fight for 15, because they were a central part of my last book. We're all fast food workers now. And I think that a lot of the leaders of Fight for 15 are the same. They're the same people a couple of generations later, a lot of single moms, women of color, who are leading this struggle to demand dignity. And, when I went around the world interviewing workers in the movement for a living wage, a few years back and still today, the word that they said over and over and over again was respect. And, and that was, and I interviewed a woman leader of a group called Respect the Bump, which organized for pregnant women, pregnant workers' rights at Walmart. And she said, you know, it was really amazing because they did a series of what they called freedom rides of Walmart workers from across the country to Bentonville, Arkansas, to the Walmart headquarters. And she said, I was stunned because I knew how many of them were literally hungry. And they just wanted to talk about respect before wages, before anything else. They wanted to talk about how they were disrespected. And I think, you know, it really made me think about Ruby Duncan and Mary Wesley in particular in Las Vegas, who said, you know, when the welfare rights movement came and told me I didn't have to be ashamed, right? Because we'd been treated so badly and stigmatized so often. And, you know, and the movement taught me that, you know, my father had paid taxes all those years, and then, you know, he never got to collect Social Security. He was killed by the Klan. You know, it all ties together. And I think that Fight for 15 is a movement that really reminded me a lot of the women of Operation Life. And on the new edition, there's a quote from a young man who was active in Fight for 15, young Black organizer by the name of Vince Stretch Sanders. And he got inspired to his activism in Fight for 15 and all the work he does. He's an amazing anti-homelessness activist and does, you know, work with, you know, helping, you know, single moms keep their self-esteem up. And he was assigned the book, right? He learned about the women and he went out and he introduced himself to them and he brought them out to meet, you know, the young organizers and you know, the young, the next generation of Black and brown folks in Vegas, and said, you have to meet the women of Operation Life. So there's a beautiful connection there and a real, you know, real life connection.
Awesome. Yes, I love it. Yes, I've rode many of buses, rain, sleet, or snow, 5 a.m. strikes. Yes, the whole gambit. Yes, so some of those, exactly, some of the stories that were told from the women in the book, definitely I could see it and see those similar things happening. So I want to talk here a little bit about, let me see. So kind of going back to the, what you spoke about, the people feeling shame and not even wanting to tell people, you know, I'm a welfare recipient, and seeing how from, like you said, being taught that, you know, your taxpayer dollars pays for these programs. And we hear a lot of times, you know, welfare mom to get a job, you know, all these things. And you hear Ruby and them talk about, like, we were working our butts off as maids, 2 and 3 jobs, you know, but still people just was not seeing us, right? And she was talking about like how companies were okay with receiving welfare during seasonal times when they had to lay off a bunch of their workers, right? But people not seeing kind of the parallel to what that really looked like for the workers themselves needing access. So kind of this whole profit, right, over people. And kind of you see Ruby talk about that time and time again. And a lot of the other women is like, well, they didn't do anything if it wasn't about profit, right? And so when you talk about them hitting the strip and seeing the strip as a big way to hit their pockets, to be seen, to get their demands heard, I think you see a lot of those similar tactics today happening, not just in this country, but all across the world. Is like, how do we create the visibility for people to see us? How are we changing those narratives that do not serve us, that we know are not true, right? Just like a lot of the women from Operation Life told time and time again their story to the press, right? Using the tools that they had in order to really reach the people and to get their messages across in the face of, you know, some of the most vicious adversaries, right? But really, like you said, encouraging one another, meeting in their homes, really creating that camaraderie. I think is another beautiful part of the story that you see in the book. And then also in documentary. And another documentary kind of focuses on kind of the beginning story of the women and how they really came together, right, from their lived experience from sharecropping down in the Delta, right, and how they even come to Nevada, right, and what kind of really forged those bonds and those relationships through those lived experiences. Can you talk a little bit about how you saw those experiences play out when it came to even building those relationships and changing some of the minds of those who, they put, and I can't remember the politician's name who, they put their stock in, they voted for this guy. They was like, they're going to be able to get us through the finish line. And then they get there and they totally abandoned them because of the context of the country. And so can you talk a little bit about like how the context of what's happening on the local, state, and in the federal really also plays a part in what is also happening as it relates to policy and legislation?
Yeah, they had, they had taken seriously the idea that they should organize and learn, and vote. And so they had, and they had created a great little Democratic Party organization on the West Side, and they got out the black vote for Mike O'Callaghan, who was, campaigned as a liberal Democrat, and then he appointed, he kept on George Miller, who was this protege and devotee of Governor Ronald Reagan's. He kept him on, right? And so it was Miller who decided to cut the women off, and they weren't having it, right? They didn't just they didn't just shut down the Strip. They kept showing up in Mike Callahan's backyard of the governor's mansion, right? And they would, stand around the swimming pool while he was swimming his laps, and say, hope you're enjoying yourself. Our children don't have anything like this. And, you're going to tell me you have a private swimming pool. You really don't have enough money to feed our children. So they stayed on him, and they also stayed in the, in political organizing. And one of the things that the welfare system did, and and I think it still does to some degree, but it's been torn apart since 1997. But one of the things it did is it made them understand the difference between how county, state, city, state, and federal politics work, how the different governments work, because they had to go to the county to get commodities food, to get extra food, and they had to go, to the city to get certain vouchers for housing repairs, and they had to go to the state to get, their welfare program administrated. But they also understood that, they had to go to the feds if they wanted to get food stamps into the state, and if they wanted to get the women infant nutrition program into the state, and job training. So they became really expert at doing these things. And so they continued to be involved in politics. And in 1972, as they said, they literally changed the complexion of the Nevada Democratic Party, and they got themselves elected as delegates to go to the Miami Democratic Convention, where they protested on behalf of, and it shows this in the documentary, on behalf of adequate minimum income, some base minimum that all Americans were entitled to. And in 76, they were Carter delegates there. They were on the floor, right? And Jimmy Carter was very interested in them. He brought Ruby to Washington, and she worked with then head of the Women's Bureau, and under Clinton, she would be Secretary of Labor, Alexis Herman. And Duncan and Herman worked together to create programs to get women access to trades that had been, exclusively male to that point, get women trained to become, plumbers and electricians and carpenters and, trades that you didn't need a college degree for, but you could make a good living. So she helped to design some of the job training policies in the Carter administration. So, it's a really remarkable story, from the cotton fields of Tallulah, Louisiana, to framing policy in Jimmy Carter's Washington.
Awesome. Yes, thank you. And so for an organization like 9 to 5, who really looks at the intersections of race, gender, and economics, which can be very intertwined, right? When we think about the issues that we want to take on, that really elevates, right, women and their families. So when you think about things like, paid leave, pay equity, access to higher wages, affordable childcare, access to affordable housing, right, and utilities, all those things that are really essential to the everyday life of a worker. Can you talk a little bit about now looking at kind of some of the lessons learned from Operations Life and Operation Nevada through Ruby and the women's work there? How do you see some of those things that we can take on now and apply in 2023 to get some of those same great things achieved, just like those women did, with seemingly a lot less access and resources, right? When we think about being in the digital era and having a quicker time to connect and touch each other. Can you talk a little bit about what are some of the takeaways that we can now reach out and build power around before we kind of turn it over to questions?
Yeah. Boy, I wish I had the answer to that question. That would be worth a lot. I mean, I think their inspiration is remarkable. And I do think, I always ask my students, is this model scalable, right? Is the model of, you know, having robust federal programs that we're going to have to lobby for at this point. But is that model of having robust federal programs, but letting them be channeled through community organizations and poor women-led organizations and poor mother-led organizations, you know, I think it is scalable. I mean, I think you can. One of the things Ruby liked to say is, you know, conservative politicians are always saying that, you know, 1,000 points of light is, you know, as Papa Bush used to say, right? You know, in each community, you know, people should be involved. And she said, we are, right? This is what we're doing. And, you know, and it's really important, I think, to build power around that because you know, poverty is depressing and it's hard. And I think, you know, it gives people a sense of pride. And, you know, the digital age provides some organized, you know, it makes it, you have to be faster, but it provides some really important, you know, organizing power too. And, you know, when you talk about the global movement, you know, and the global movement for a living wage and all the Fight for 15 marches, you know, I literally saw people holding up their phones, uploading their own videos of marches and downloading videos of marches. And, you know, one was in Tegucigalpa and a woman, you know, sending solidarity from Bangladesh. And so, you know, I think that's a really important thing. And the other thing that the digital has given this new generation, I think, is the ability to, you know, to fight back against these really powerful corporations by, you know, deflating their very expensive ad campaigns, right? So, you know, all the McShame and not loving it campaigns, you know, that, you know, attempted to undermine. I think McDonald's spent $5 or $6 million for Justin Timberlake to sing that jingle globally, the I'm Loving It. So I think all of those things are, you know, what we can do now, but I think we have lost this idea that you can hand over anti-poverty work to people in their own communities. And that's why, along with this book, I edited a collection on the war on poverty from the bottom up. And, you know, amazing things happened in communities across the country with this notion that, you know, we should give this money to the people who know where it needs to be spent. And I think that lesson of the war on poverty, and particularly of the welfare rights movement, is one that we can't lose. And one connection between the welfare rights movement and these programs we all depend on, it was welfare mothers in 17 states who sued to make food stamps a national program, to make WIC a national program, right? And the early screening. So we owe that to them, right? Food stamps now feeds 1 in 4 children and between something like 1 in 6 and 1 in 8 adults, depending on how hard times are. I mean, we owe them a great debt of gratitude. So best way to repay, I think, is to remember to, you know, to listen to the wisdom of poor moms.
Yes, awesome. Well, thank you so much for a rich discussion. For all those, we hope you have your questions ready. We're going to now turn it over to our audience to drop your questions.
Nothing yet.
And I really definitely enjoyed reading the book, connecting through the stories, and just seeing how those cycles still continue, right? And how it's really up to us, right? The people to really disrupt a lot of those things that we know are not right, and that we know are infringing upon our rights, right? So, in really that disruptive power and what that looks like, and strategizing around that, I think is another lesson learned that I took away from the book as well.
Well, yeah, and you know, the hotel workers in recent years and the McDonald's workers have done very similar kinds of disruptions, right? In 2018, and okay, I see one question. Yeah. In anyway, 2018, 2019, women McDonald's workers in 12 cities shut down streets and shut down traffic to protest sexual harassment in their workplaces, right? And we saw hotel workers beginning in Chicago, but also other cities, create the hands off, pants on initiatives, and they became part of union contracts to prevent them from being sexually harassed. So I think, the spirit of those women lives. So this question.
Are the daughters and sons of the original Stormer active today?
Yeah. They absolutely are. One of the nice things about the documentary is you get to meet Ruby's daughter, Sandra Gilbert. And Sandra is an amazing education activist and in Washington, D.C. And she's shown with the community garden that she's building. She's really big into urban farming, as were these women, right? She knows that. Mary Wesley and Alversa Beals grew so much in their gardens that they could feed hungry people themselves, and they did very often. So yeah, Sandra's active, and Ruby's son, David, is a lawyer and community activist, and Mary Wesley's daughter and grandkids have helped create, they created an amazing program during the pandemic, along with Stretch Sanders, who I talked about, where they would ride their bicycles out. Las Vegas is so spread out, to areas where there were homeless folks. And they would give them COVID tests and blankets and, shampoo and toothpaste and food and all the things they needed. And they called it the Mary Wesley Ride for Food. So there's a lot of activism on the part of their children and on the part of other people who grew up in Vegas knowing them. So, not their direct children, but the young people they saw.
Awesome. And I have another question that has popped up. If someone only has a little bit of time to learn about worker organizing, where would you recommend them go to learn?
Well, let's see. I mean, there's a lot of stuff on the web that's really great. If you don't have time to go to a union meeting, you can go to the website of, just to pick one, because they make so many of our clothes, the Bangladesh Center for Worker Solidarity, where they talk about job safety and, and how our clothes are made today. So I think there's a lot of places that you can go, but the Clean Clothes campaign on the web is really important. And although it has a checkered past, the AFL-CIO Solidarity Center is a very rich. If I had to pick one site, that might be it, because you can get information from all around the world. But yeah, I would go. I think the web is probably the quickest place to do it.
Any other questions? And then also to the second question that was dropped, find an organization too that maybe work on workplace issues that you care about. That's another way to get connected, to learn, and to meet people closer to where you are as well. Political homes are important as well. And it's another place where you can grow and connect.
Absolutely. Yeah. Well, I will promote my other book, We Are All Fast Food Workers Now. I wrote it in very short chapters, just 5 and 10 page and 15 page chapters. So if you don't have a whole lot of time, it's got stories of worker organizing here in the US and around the world.
All right. If we don't have any other questions, I'll turn it back over to you. And thank you all for joining us. And Annelise, thank you so much for your book, your contribution. It was such a pleasure.
Yeah, thank you, Shanda. Thank you for everything that you do and that 9 to 5 does. And, I was telling these guys before the event started, I'm so excited to be, doing an event with a feminist bookstore that's almost 50 and 9 to 5, the legendary women's labor organization and coalition. So this has been a real pleasure and an honor for me.
It's an honor for us. Thank you so much. This is a beautiful event, and I hope that it will spark folks' interest and excitement. Get out there, go find an organization, learn more. There's so many opportunities to learn. And I think, the past is never past, right? We know that. And I think this book was really inspiring to me to see how scholarship can speak to us across time, right? So it is really important that we return to our contemporary histories, right? There's a lot of stuff that came out, in the early 21st century that it can teach us a lot about where we are right now. And so this is a good reminder. A book does not have to be reissued for you to go back and revisit it. Though it is wonderful that this book has been reissued and updated. And there are many that I would like to pull out of the vault and get reissued. But we have so many wonderful movement histories, and we're lucky to have them. And so it is an important period to revisit and learn from. And I think, a lot of younger folks, even this period of history is not taught in school yet. There's so much that is not really sat with and studied. And so I'm so grateful that we have this from you and that we get this beautiful new edition. So if folks would like to buy a copy of Storming Caesar's Palace, ordinarily we have a one-click button for it. The book is not quite yet at the warehouse. We thought it was going to be at the warehouse. So we're considering this more of a pre-order event, even though that's not quite how we thought we were going to do it. So how we're going to get the book to you is if you can just send us an email at charisbooksandmore.com with Storming Caesar's Palace in the subject line and your contact info, and say, hey, I'd like to put my name on the list to get a book. We will get back in touch with you and make that happen as soon as we get our copies. So we apologize for the inconvenience of that, but we are very excited to get those books shipped out to you as soon as they get shipped to us. We also always encourage you to please ask your public library to carry this book. It is really important that public libraries carry books like this so that they are accessible to all people, and consider buying a copy for your college library, for your child's high school library, all these things. This book is appropriate for a teenager to read and learn from, and we would love to get books like this into more schools. So those are great. Yeah, especially in the South, right? We need to be fighting the good fight about what books we believe deserve to be in schools, right? So that is a tiny little bit of activism that we could do. And sometimes if you just slip it to the librarian, you never know, right? It can happen. So those are some things that we always encourage folks to do. So I also put the donate link to Kara's Circle here. There is a link also to 9to5.org where you can also donate to support their work. Kara's also recently had a wonderful May Day event focused on women workers. That is on our YouTube channel. So if you've never visited our YouTube channel, there was a lot of really great education and conversation around local organizing of fast food workers and retail workers. So please check that out if you're just like thirsting for more information locally. There's so much good stuff going on, and we want folks to get involved. This is an important time. So thank you both so much. This was a true pleasure, and I hope you both stay safe and well. And then we get to host you again.
Yes, yeah, thank you.
I just wanted to close with one image because we're talking about education. That's nice to have in our minds, and that is that the original edition of this book inspired the start of this, really the story of the women, inspired the creation of an elementary school in Las Vegas, the Ruby Duncan Elementary School, whose ethos is that they're going to teach kids and there's still kids, very diverse school from very low income community, but an amazing school that's fully solarized. But their ethos is to teach them that if you've got a problem in your community, you see a problem around you, organize from the ground up. And so I think it's really nice to have that image. And, you know, as we battle over public schools today and what's taught in public schools, that's something to get active around too. That, you know, by teaching these histories, rather than make kids uncomfortable, we make kids excited, right? And we make kids, you know, take their lives into their own hands as the women of Operation Life did. So, you know, if you get down hearing about all these education battles. Think about the Ruby Duncan Elementary School, and, you know, think about all the elementary schools where kids can be learning about this kind of story and to do that sort of work.
Yes. Thank you. I love that.
Yeah.
Thank you both so much.
Yeah.
Take good care. Thanks to everybody.